Marodon. I'm one of the animators of the Global Research Network on Public Development Banks, and one of these networks concentrates on studying how it could work at the Coherent system and what should be or what could be an ideal financial architecture system. So, Sherry, you will be animating the panel, and so I leave the floor to you. Please.
Great. Thank you so much, Regis, and thank you all for being here and for inviting me to moderate the panel. We've been thinking a lot about the question of MDBs and national development banks working as a system in the context of FFD4. For those of you who don't know, national development banks were actually a core part of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which was in 2015. And now that the global framework on financing for development is being updated, there's a lot of thinking as to the role of national development banks in the new agenda and how to optimize and to maximize the impact of that. So I'm going to start very quickly by just giving a little of a background for those just on what the thinking and some of the discussions have been ongoing in New York on this, and why, to sort of give a basis for why development banks and public development banks are so essential to the agenda. And then we're going to go to the panelists. We have 4 really great papers that are going to be presented, and then some really excellent responders as well. So just to start with the zero draft, so the co-facilitators have put out already a zero draft for the outcome document. That came out around 2 months ago, something like that. And it's already, the global environment has actually changed pretty dramatically since then already. So at the time, the draft recognizes that the world is in a sustainable development crisis. I think that the first draft, when it comes out, will have to also acknowledge that we're also have enormous geopolitical pressures that are continuing to shift. And what does that mean for the financing for sustainable development? And what does that mean for FFD4? There are some voices that say how unlucky we all are to be having this negotiation happening as the world is changing so much. The other side is that you need to have them more than ever, and that the importance of having the world come together to show that there's still to rebuild trust and to continue to build trust in multilateralism and to show that the world can still come together is more critical than ever. But the zero draft as it is notes that financing, the financing divide and the cost of borrowing for many developing countries is really at the core of the sustainable development crisis. And so it puts forward 2 buckets of solutions. One is a impact-focused, large-scale sustainable development investment push, and the second is ambitious architectural reforms to enable that investment push, as well as to deal with questions of stability, to make that sustainable over time, so stability of the financial system and governance issues are part of that. In terms of the investment push, there are 3 characteristics. One is that it be very large, but the other is that it also have impact. So as opposed to 2015, when there was a discussion about billions to trillions, really focusing on just the numbers, I think now there's a real focus on impact and what does that money do, and how do we ensure that that money that goes, that the money we're talking about has a big impact for development, particularly for developing countries and countries most in need. The second part of that is that to invest in the SDGs implies you need some directionality. And that recognizes that the need for directionality means that public policy and public plans, tax system, public budgets, regulatory frameworks, and public banks to intermediate funds are, in a sense, at the core of the agenda. So if you have an agenda that needs directionality, you need public leadership. And so this is one of the reasons why it also acknowledges the important role for the private sector. So that the private sector has a critical role to play, but understanding that the private investment and finance will not align with public goals on its own, and that it cannot replace the public sector, they have to work together. So it's very much a public-private agenda, but trying to go to this public-private agenda from a new perspective of understanding why that didn't work in the past 10 years, and what new has to be done to make that public-private agenda work. So therefore, at the core of this is both private entities and how do we bring them in and align them? What tools does the public sector have to lead on that? And then the other side of it is the public sector itself. And so that's one of the reasons why the role of public entities is so critical in this discussion. We can break that down, the public side, into two pieces. So the first is the traditional, well, there are many pieces, there are more than two pieces, but one, let's say, is ODA, the traditional official development assistance, as well as some of the new bilateral donors and bilateral partners. And the other is, again, the role of public financial institutions like public development banks. On the ODA side, well, I'm sure many of you heard the news from the UK today. So we already knew that the numbers coming out for last year were going to be down, and that the numbers look, with what's happening with the US and the UK announcements, that the ODA numbers look like the amounts are going down even more. I mean, one of the issues we have to be really careful about now in New York, this discussion on impact started much earlier, but it shouldn't be seen as saying that impact because we don't have the money. So I think we need to be very careful as how this is all articulated, that you need impact, but that doesn't mean that that one is saying that just because the amounts are going down. But so that one issue is then the question of how does one address these really glaring needs, many needs that can only be addressed with public money in a world where public money is going down and international public money is going down. And so the question of how do you think about the quality of ODA, how do you ensure that it goes to countries most in need and that it doesn't, even prior to this past year, the numbers in development cooperation went up, the ODA numbers went up, but the amount going to countries did not go up. The percentage going to countries, in countries actually was going down. So this question of how does one ensure, and I think that one of our colleagues, Thomas Melonio, will be talking to some of those issues in his paper. Then the second issue we have is on public development banks. The Zero draft has a section on it about strengthening NDBs, leveraging resources from MDBs better, from multilateral development banks, how do they work better, and then calling for countries without NDBs to establish them if they want to help countries do that, and to give technical support. And then also this question that's come up for this panel, which is the idea of working together as a system. And I think that there is also discussion of even strengthening that language in the outcome document even further. But I think this question of how the system can work best will be discussed today at this panel. And one of the other aspects that's part of the discussion and integral to the discussion is the development cooperation architecture more broadly. And so there's a big discussion of how can that we all know there's enormous fragmentation and that the development cooperation system doesn't work as well as it should in countries. And there's a big discussion on how can the architecture in countries be redesigned. This is, of course, linked to questions of country platforms and also questions of national plans. If you have a country platform, who is in that platform? Do we go beyond the MDBs if we bring in other players such as national development banks? And then how do you also ensure that those are country-owned so it doesn't become a case of the external actors coming together and putting more pressure on countries? So what can be done to ensure country-owned? And that again brings back the story of national development banks. Because if we can bring in other players, particularly national players, to help change the nature of those, to ensure that the nature of those platforms is led by the countries. So I think these are a bunch of the different questions that are going on, and I'm also really interested, and I've read the papers, but very much want to hear some of the discussion around ideas to use the system to strengthen, to really be able to fill the gaps in development finance with high quality development finance. So we're going to start with Thomas Melonio, the chief economist from AFD, who's going to present his paper, again linked on some of these questions around the ODA side of this discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Sherry and organizers. Actually, I'm going to present very briefly two papers, one that was written 2 years ago, which was called ODA at the Edge of Consequences, and one that was released late last year on a double standard for development. The first one, actually it's related to what you said earlier on, Sherry, meaning the ODA fatigue. And I think there's some very important reasons why the umbrella of ODA, which is the budget pot on which we finance a lot of things, now is being challenged. You mentioned the US, you mentioned the UK, but we could mention France, let's face it. And why is that so? Probably because the differentiation between middle-income countries and low-income countries has become so important that typically when you say in France that you are providing ODA to China, to Indonesia, to Brazil, the public is going to react badly to such characterization of the flows and money we're providing to this country. And rightfully so, because truly speaking, what AFD, the sort of partnership we have, for example, in Brazil, is not official development assistance. I mean, we have joint interest, we sign deals, we have technical exchanges regularly, but it does not correspond to the idea of aid, which now I think is more in people's mind is more humanitarian aid. But the world aid does not really correspond to anything we're doing, in particular in emerging countries. So part of this ODA fatigue is related to the fact that emerging countries have emerged, and now we have new relationships from France, typically. And in that sense, asking for money in Parliament, for example, for ODA and saying we're going to use it in emerging country doesn't really make sense. So it makes ODA in general weaker, and the issue is that when it happens, your budget gets cut, even for very low-income countries and humanitarian purposes. So the ODA umbrella is not efficient any longer, and probably the solidarity must not disappear, but we should say it more clearly that grant money typically, or the most concessional terms, should apply only to low-income countries and probably to vulnerability as well, because there are some highly climate-exposed countries now, and they deserve a particular treatment different from that of emerging countries. So one reason why ODA is under attack is because its framework has evolved poorly over time, and we need to be more specialized between low-income and vulnerable countries on the one hand and emerging countries on the other hand. So that's what we said in ODA at the edge of consequences as a very rapid summary. Now we have a second problem also coming from the original framework of ODA, where when the world is divided into developed and developing countries, we built a framework whereby we report most of our flows based on ODA statistics, and this has become a liability. Just to give you the example of France, very recently, as late as last Sunday, there were front covers in the newspaper saying 15 billions for ODA in France. That's a scandal. It's too much. The reality, when you look at how much it costs, it's only 6 billion in France. Flows to developing countries, the cash equivalent. Of course, we do leverage on that, but ODA statistics have allowed for way too much. I'd like to say we pimp statistics, and we should not do that, because at the end of the day, the public will resent the amount that's being used for ODA or international action. And again, my concern is that there will be cuts all the way around, whether for action for global public goods in emerging countries, but also for action in low-income countries. So this is why in the paper on a double standard, of course it's an intellectual provocation, we advocate for a double standard, one being how much it costs to do international action, whether it's for solidarity and vulnerability in poor countries, whether it's to protect global public goods, but we need to be able to tell the public exactly how much it costs. I'm always surprised when you ask Americans, Britons, French people how much they spend for ODA international actions. They tend to give figures like 15% of the budget, 20% of the national budget, while it's truly between 0.5 and 1% of the budget. So we have a massive misperception of international action, and this plays against international actions and against multilateralism. So it's not all this debate on the metrics of development finance. It's of much interest for technicians and technocrats like us, but it also has consequences in the public opinion. So I think we should quite aggressively bring in more clarity in the debate, whether in OECD countries, but also make sure that the funds available for development are well accounted for and well aligned with national priorities. So I don't want to spend too much time on country platforms, because it's been there have been a number of discussion already, and I think it's moving in the right direction. But development banks in general should pay more attention to the true alignment of their flows towards national priorities. I was actually quite interested by the situation here in South Africa, because in the context of JETP, it's the South African government that actually stamps flows saying, okay, this is aligned with my JETP priorities, or this is not aligned. And I think ultimately, in particular when you're discussing loans, but would be true on grants as well, you need to check the alignment of flows with national priorities and also with the SDGs in general. So I think it's one way development finance could evolve. Maybe one last word on the system itself. I think we've spent too little time working on how the financial architecture works. So no one probably in this room knows exactly how much MDBs are sending or lending to regional development banks or to national development banks. There's no clarity as well on the specific role of MDBs versus regional development banks versus national development banks. But I think it wouldn't be very wise to assume that everyone is good at everything. So there must be specialties. MDBs are AAA, so they could share their AAA. Probably they are international, so they have higher transactional costs. They need to lend bigger sums of money. They cannot do last mile finance for sure. So there has to be a stronger degree of specialization between MDBs, regional and national development bank. I don't want to expand, but is it really for MDBs to do local currency financing when probably MDBs could do it better? That's an open question. But if you're a professional of that sector, and we almost all are in this room, we know that the bigger bank and the national banks, they need to do bigger tickets, while the national ones can do smaller ones. So there has to be less competition, more cooperation, and also more specialization in the system. Yeah, and Shari, you referred to the Addis Ababa document. All the actors were accurately described, but the relationships between the actors, not that much. So is there a target, typically, of how much MDBs should invest in regionals or in nationals? Actually, there is not. But I would like to see some level of, some numbers on which we could base our activities, whether AFD, but would be true for other actors in the system. So I would like to see a bit more numbers in the relationship between the actors in the system, which I think would bring a lot of value in our discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, and I'm looking to Jajun for some more data we need to be collecting. And I was going to say something, but I think it's the perfect segue to the next speaker as well, but one of the questions, and I think that your point on the different roles is something that's come up in several of the discussions that is called for to strengthen in the next draft of FFD. And so I think that's something we can look for. But the next paper will be by Thomas Marois, who's a professor from McMaster University, and he's going to talk a little bit about the National Development Bank's potential to boost SDG investment with MDB support. So it seems like just the perfect segue. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Sherry. And welcome, everyone. I tried to convince Fix to have cocktails here with us today, but unfortunately we have to wait till afterwards. So bear with us for a little bit longer, if you will, please. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I just first want to acknowledge that this paper is not my paper alone, but a number of important co-researchers, Jacob Wolford, Régis Marodon, and Aloyse Gungen. This was a pretty labor-intensive project. Thank you. Next slide. You read my mind, Jean-Baptiste. That has really emerged from a fairly long-term collaboration over the last few years with the AFD, where we first asked the question of, how are MDBs collaborating with national development banks, and presented that paper last year in Cartagena. And then we got to talking afterwards and say, well, we really need to reverse that research question as well and hear from the national development banks in terms of, what do NDBs need from the MDBs to help foster a more catalytic public development bank response to financing, it's a very long question, financing the 2030 SDGs, and importantly, at the pace, scale, and on the terms appropriate for global green and just transition. So that was a task that we set ourselves back early in 2024. Next slide, please. And to answer that question, we interviewed 18 national development banks in the end. We contacted about 33, so thank you to everyone who did respond. I understand it is a labor-intensive thing, but I would also ask to NDBs to keep their doors open to us. We can't do this work without you. and we appreciate your collaboration. So we interviewed over 18 hours of interviews, nearly 200,000 words and transcripts, and went on to prepare a synthesis and interpretation of those interviews and the responses to the questionnaire. It's resulted in a working paper. We have a 2-page synthesis in the back. We are going to the next stage, which is passing on that working paper back to the national development banks for further verification of what we've studied, and we'll then publish the final report at some point with the AFD. Next slide, please. In terms of the results, the first one should come as no surprise to many in this room, but as Thomas said, we don't really know the scale of that. But NDBs do collaborate with the multilateral development banks. In the previous paper that we looked at the MDBs, we were able to get a figure looking over a period of 5 years of the 9 multilateral development banks. We came up with a figure of 34 billion, which is not that much, to be honest, over a period of 5 years. But it's true, we don't track these flows. We don't know. And I know that you're trying to figure that out presently, but this is something that we recommended last year, but that we formally begin to track these flows. So they're collaborating, but the collaboration from the view of the NDBs is intensely risk and cost sensitive. That it is really about whether or not they're going to be able to pass those savings on to their communities, and to other banks, and especially in terms of green finance. If it's not worth the while, their clients simply aren't taking it up. So it's intensely risk and cost sensitive, but also, importantly, too complex, too slow, and too insensitive to domestic circumstances. We have a number of direct quotes from the NDBs through the working report that really illustrate these in very concrete terms. Second finding and result is also, importantly, that the NDBs derive real tangible benefits from the technical assistance of the multilateral development banks, but both in terms of financial, but also non-financial. This will lead into some recommendations later on. And then the third result is that, in particular, the Global South NDBs, so 14 of the 18 interviewed were from the Global South, have a sense of being unequal and subordinate partners to the multilaterals, and forgive the harsh language here, we're just being very forthright, that the multilaterals do not fully appreciate local conditions. And so there's some work that needs to be done around that. Next slide, please. The 4 recommendations that we worked together on this paper, and the first one is really that which we cannot do without, the single most important one, if we want to move forward with global green and just transitions at the pace, scale, and on the terms required, is that we simply must find ways to deliver much more cheaper climate finance to the national development banks. Otherwise, the NDBs will simply find no demand for the finance. They will just go to the market. They will go to private ones who provide no conditions, have no interest in whether you're climate finance or green finance or biodiversity. It makes no difference to them. So if you want them to move, you need substantively cheaper financing, period. Next slide, please. Second recommendation, then, is in terms of the multilateral development banks, a recommendation that they rethink technical assistance, and there's more details on these, of course, in the paper, to better enable sustainable development financing of green and just transitions relative to national context. Meaning that the technical assistance should be more about building permanent internal capacity within national development banks, not simply money to buy consultancies, which is a one-off shot, but build it as a permanent program over time so it enables the NDBs to build up their own internal knowledge and expertise, and permanent knowledge and expertise. The third recommendation then turns that onto the national development banks, that there is a responsibility domestically for them to build a stronger, more substantive pipeline of attractive climate and just transition projects. And in the words of the NDBs, much of this was related to domestic government policy, that they need support within their own countries on a whole range of different issues. There were a lot of things brought up, but to enable them to be more active in this. So there is clearly, this is not simply let's let the world take care of this problem, but domestically they need to be able to take care of that themselves. Next slide, please. So to support the three above in many ways, and speaking very much to what Sherry began with, is that we recommend that UN member states call on the banks that they own, the national development banks and the multilateral development banks, to foster a global public development bank ecosystem grounded in accountable public-public collaborations. And, just as Thomas, the other TM, Thomas Melonio said, we really need less competition in this sphere, more collaboration. And that's, both to understand what we're doing well, but also what's going poorly and what needs to be magnified and improved. Last slide, please. So just to thank you for your time, thank you for this opportunity to share these results, and we will be sending out the final version of this report within the next few months, but you can find the current working paper on our website. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for that. And thanks so much for the paper and for the presentation. And one of the things that it hasn't been brought in, but it really stood out in the paper, something that was also should have been in other discussions, was this question of rethinking technical assistance, and how we all know that it doesn't work and that flying people in and out is not the answer usually, but to really think about how does one change the way that works and how do we create a system that works better on that. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I say one quick
Please
thing to that? And this is part of a discussion we had yesterday at the University of Cape Town and Stellenbosch University, is that part of that is national development banks supporting scholars in their own countries to be able to take on this, so scholarships, programs, and so on, instead of flying in and out foreign experts.
No, and maybe there's also room for peer learning and exercises, but to really rethink some of the way that we've been thinking about technical assistance and capacity development. Great. The next paper is going to also build on this discussion, and Richard Castle-Wright from Boston University, who used to be at UNCTAD, is going to talk about blended finance from the ground up, and how multilateral and national development banks can collaborate to scale up climate finance. So, Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Sherry, and thank you to FIX for inviting us. This, as with Thomas's paper, this is very much a collaborative effort across colleagues at the Boston University GDP Center, so I need to acknowledge that. And the case for closer collaboration has been made already, I think. I'm not going to go into the details. Let me just make a few more general references that I think speak a little bit to what Sherry said. We are focusing here on MDB-NDB relationships. Public balance sheets are more extensive than that, and there are much more opportunities if you look for relations with sovereign wealth funds, if you bring in public pension schemes, and ultimately if you bring in central banks, all of which are public institutions and should be seen as part of the financial ecosystem that we're trying to leverage and mobilize and leverage for meeting the delivery of public goods and services, which I think is what we're trying to do here. And in that context, I think it's very important. I mean, Sherry, you gave a general introduction about what that implied. It does imply public investment, which you didn't mention in your list of public responsibilities. And the downsizing of public investment over the course of the last 40 years is a huge challenge when it comes to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals in all their dimensions. We can argue about the mix between public and private ultimately, but without a mobilization of public investment, I don't think many of these goals are achievable. And of course, in that context, and I think Thomas's paper also looks at that, there's a certain skeptical approach to the notion of public-private partnerships. I don't want to go into that here. I will leave you with a quote by Charles Kenny from the Center for Global Development, who is an expert on PPPs, who referred to them, and I quote, as reality-based as a Shrek movie. For those that know their Disney cartoons, you can follow the logic of what is implied by him. But there's a critique of PPPs implicit in what we've done. Not that private investment is not important, it's central, but how you mobilize private resources is a separate question. And the last point I would make that is important for the argument that we're trying to make, NDBs are not profit-maximizing institutions. They are policy-amplifying institutions, and that gives them a very critical role in terms of their place in the wider arena of international cooperation. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, and making a strong case for much closer partnerships between MDBs and NDBs, which is the basis of this paper, we've kind of identified 5 areas of complementarity between MDBs and NDBs that provide the basis for what we call blending from the ground up. And those are familiar from what has already been said and what particularly Shari said. There's a accessing of wider sources of finance, particularly external financing, which we know is a major constraint, particularly for NDBs. Lowering the cost of capital, which is a ubiquitous challenge that Thomas already made reference to. The challenges around risk management and risk mitigation, where there's obvious complementarities. The need to manage the project cycle from design to implementation, which has already come up, and the wider question of capacity building. And we, to try and illustrate the challenges and the opportunities around these complementarities, we take 5 case studies in the paper, all of which are focused on green energy projects, and all of which bring in, I think, to the discussion these different areas of complementarity where there's room for closer NDB-MDB collaboration. We picked, I mean, obviously these are illustrative, they're not in any way intended to be comprehensive, but we tried to pick multilateral development banks from across the regions, Latin America, Asia, Europe, and we also included the Islamic Development Bank in there too, and a also selection of national development banks, because they're not homogeneous entities either. You have, most of them are public, but you have private ones. Some of them deal in first-tier lending, others second-tier or both. So we tried to have a mixture to give a sense of the wider environment that we're dealing with. And for those that are interested in the specifics that are indicated here, you can read the paper. Obviously, our concern is to draw wider conclusions about how we can scale up these kinds of partnerships between multilateral and national development banks. And as Shari and Thomas said, there are real opportunities to scale up these kinds of partnerships, but they do face a number of challenges. And one of the challenges is the lack of a common framework for thinking about the relationship between MDBs and NDBs, and the kinds of next slide please, and the kinds of policy findings and recommendations are very much about how we can find common language, common narrative that can strengthen the relationship between multilateral development banks and national development banks along the lines of the complementarities that I think are the basis of cooperation. And some of that is already happening already, and some of the conclusions that we reach about finding ways to deal with currency risk, the elaboration of guarantee instruments, of blending instruments, I think is already under discussion. Obviously, the country platform discussion is, I think, a real opportunity to build MDB, NDB linkages into this ecosystem. And that the Brazilian presidency of the G20 obviously opened that door, I think, a little bit wider. Hopefully the FFD conference in Seville will open that door even more. But having a common framework, we think, is critical, both because it's the basis on which trust is built, and trust is an incredibly important and difficult, intangible quality that needs to be built into the system between MDBs and NDBs, and I think Thomas's work shows that difficulty of building trust, and so common principles around that, I think, are critical, and that a kind of common framework is critical for the scaling up challenge, which is ultimately the reason that we do need to build more closer MDB-NDB partnerships. Thank you.
Thanks. So we've heard about that, starting with this idea that we need to really specify the different roles and complementarities, including some of the challenges, and then maybe a way to help that in terms of setting up some common framework. One question, Richard, in your case studies, did the MDBs learn from were there cases where it seemed that the MDBs were learning from the national knowledge, from the local knowledge? Was that part of the when we think about where the national banks have a comparative
I think that is on the ground knowledge of the kind of linkages that need to be built to ensure that you get not only investments on the right scale, but as you said, the right kind of quality of investment and the right direction of investment is somewhere where the NDBs have real advantage, I think, over multilateral development banks. So, and there are cases where there's clearly a learning process between the two that takes place, and so that is, I think, a very important part of the advantage of this kind of partnership.
Great. And one of the questions maybe to think about as in the discussions also for the responders would be, can we take lessons from this to think about national bank collaboration? And what can we take from these studies from MDB national banks to think about the national side as well?
We just had a meeting of the economists of African national development banks earlier, and that was one of the issues that came up, how you build up that kind of collaboration at that level.
Great. Okay, great. So we're going to now go to, thanks Richard, we're going to go to our next speaker. And in a sense, I think we're going to go back to, we're going to look at both multilateral and bilateral lending. And we're going to focus on some of the questions about vulnerability. And so how much are countries how much are donors and partners thinking about vulnerabilities in their lending from both, going back to Thomas Melonio, this Thomas's first comments, thinking about bilateral lending, and then to think, and to go then to think. And so this is Soso Feindwono from Verdi is going to present his paper. So Soso, over to you.
Thank you very much, dear moderator, for giving me the floor. So I'm going to present a preliminary versions of a research paper jointly developed with Patrick Guillemot, who is the president of Verdi. This work is as part of the current reflections that we have on to see if multilateral development bank allocate their constitutional resources, and to see exactly, to reveal their behavior in terms of that allocations, to see exactly, because we have stated commitment, and we have realization. So we are trying through this paper to compare, to reveal exactly what we have in reality in terms of the allocations, to see if those institutions are taking into account vulnerability in their allocation process. I think that this paper is a logical continuation of what they have been presented previously, because the previous paper examined how development finance is measured and how institutions mobilize resources. So now we turn to see exactly if those institutions differentiate countries by their vulnerability. So to start, let me pose the context of that studies. Recently, I think that most of you in this room know that your United Nations General Assembly has adopted a new index, which is the MVI, Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, and the purpose of that index is to complement the income, because in terms of needs of allocations, the main indicators that most of those institutions use is income. So income is important, but it's not sufficient. We are agree on that, because the income is a status of an ex post realizations. We need to complement this by by another tool which take into account the ex-ante risk faced by countries. In that manner, we capture the country's structural handicap by taking those two concepts. So, this is the positions that we have in FERDI during many years in our work. How to take vulnerability in the allocation process, not by using this via different windows, but how to integrate this directly into the formula. Example, the PBA formula. So we have also in June 2023 the MDB vision statement, which also align with the same process, encouraging development bank and I5 to take into account vulnerability in their allocations process. So for the methodology, we use the concept, you revisit the concept of selectivity, the selectivity meaning the quality of geographical distributions of concessional resources. This is not exactly the old versions of selectivity who is just focusing on, the recipient policies. So we use two approaches. The first approach is average selectivity. So by that approach, we try to design the profile of each donors. We multiply the index MVI indicators of each recipient countries by with the share of the allocations it receives, and we sum this amount to have some idea on the portfolio of each donor to see to which extent this donor take into account vulnerability in the allocation process. We have the second approach who is based on differential selectivity. Differential selectivity, by this we use an econometric model in which we regress, aid per capita on vulnerability index and also income. So that data that we use, we have the ODA data from 2020 to 2023. So we take the 3 years average to avoid the inter-annual fluctuations of data. And in terms of vulnerability indicators, we use firstly the MVI, and we also have the second indicators, that is the FSVI, which is the FERDI structural vulnerability indicators. As we are aware that the MVI is not perfect, MVI has some methodological issue that we try to correct in our FSVI indicators, and the other data that we use is the income per capita. So key finding, let me go very fastly. For the average selectivity, we find that multilateral finance a little bit more vulnerable countries than bilaterals. AIDA and ADF show a stronger preference for vulnerable and poor countries. This is in terms of average selectivity. Looking at the differential selectivity, we have shown that multilateral as a whole, because this is on average, this is an average. In particular, AIDA and ADF do not differentiate allocations based on vulnerability level, And we also found that UNDP and I5 show more sensitivity to vulnerability than other multilaterals. Also, bilaterals do not follow a uniform logic in considering vulnerability. And we find also a paradox regarding the European Union institutions with regard to vulnerability. For those countries in general, as a whole, we have low average selectivity but significant differential selectivity. So the implications of this research, it's clear for us that to make vulnerability allocations more sensitive to vulnerability, you need to integrate this directly into a formula, but using the good index for that type of exercise. And for the further research of this, because as I was saying at the beginning of my interventions, this paper is a preliminary version, so we need to elaborate it a little bit more by taking account more specifications in terms of econometrics, to extend, example, the measurement of to the full set of MDB, to also studies the evolutions of allocations practices over a period, over a long, because this is a specific period. We have 2020 and 2022, COVID, and just after COVID, this is not systematically reveal the entire behavior of donors. So we need maybe to have a long period to, to track the evolutions of the behavior of donors. So also to extend the approach that we have used to other flows, not only to ODA, and also the special examinations of the sensitivity of adaptation to climate change. We have developed this type of index at FERDI, which is physical vulnerability to climate change, and our purpose will be to use the same indicators, but another model, to use financial adaptation flows to this specific indicator. That will be the next part of the work that we have to do. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much. And I think, clearly the question about vulnerabilities and income and how money is being allocated becomes even more important. And in this case where we have funds that money is less money available. and it really goes, Thomas, one of your comments that I just hadn't thought of was, we've always thought when ODA numbers, every country wants to say we have higher numbers, we're meeting our targets, we're meeting 0.7 or half of 0.7, whatever it happens to be. But this new pressure to say, no, we're not giving a lot of money for aid, and how one balances both the pressure for lower numbers and the pressure for higher numbers. But either way, the idea of understanding what's driving the allocation and how much of this is vulnerabilities and how do we account for this is so critical to know right now, and to be able to come up with ideas for how the international system addresses these issues. So thank you so much to all four of the papers. We're now going to go to, we have three commenters and responders, and we're going to start with Mahmoud Mohdin, who is the UN Special Envoy for financing the 2030 Development Agenda at the UN, and to give your thoughts on what you've heard and anything else you want to discuss. Yes, please do.
Right. Thank you so much. Very important four topics and great presentations. Thank you so much for your efforts and your good outcomes. I only wish that the world that we're living in would allow your recommendations to be realized, not just in full, but even partially. And I'll come to that. And perhaps on the time that you are preparing these important papers, what we were considering as temporary or transitional is not a trend now. I think especially on areas related to ODA, as I put it recently with my good colleague and friend Homi Haras, it's the end of old ODA as we know it. And we hope to be proven wrong on that, but it has been really showing us signals of these kinds of different changes of ODA that I cannot actually implicate Homi in what I'm going to say now. We cannot just implicate one administration of changes. This had been really seen for quite some time. with those who have been involved in replenishment of essential funds for development like IDA, see that, for those who have been involved in the replenishment of vertical funds, including the Green Climate Fund, had seen these kind of changes. So they are not cyclical, they are not temporary, they are trends, and they are not, these changes are not necessarily linked to a war that we all wish to end, all wars, not just the war in Europe. This is not just linked to temporary budget constraints, but basically it's a kind of a trend that I see implicitly in some of the recommendations of some of the papers that I'm going through now, recommending some expansion of contributors base to ODA. But will that be ODA as we know it, or what we can consider as new ODA, because it will come with different approaches, perhaps with different tracking systems, and different impact measurement as well, to your point, Shari, that you mentioned earlier. It's not the quantity and the size, it's the impact. But as I said, the 4 papers are really very useful to be read together, very much complementary in different ways, from realizing the potential of partnerships or better partnerships between the MDBs and the NDBs, to areas related to scaling up finance, especially areas related to climate, then matters related to vulnerability, and of course tracking. As we know, if you take matters, and this is my second point, the first was about ODA and where do we see it. The second point, if you take the matters more from the recipients, from where you call it beneficiaries in the world of the World Bank and its brothers and sisters, it's the client countries. If you are seeing it from the UN, it's the member states. This is the same people as client countries. And if you are taking it from IMF, that now has, through some of its funds like PRGT and RST, some indirect impact on some of these activities, you are called the authorities, not member states and not clients. And that, in the political economy of the relationship, it has different ways and protocols of the relationship. But anyway, the world is not just about MDBs and NDBs. It's great to realize them, but of course there are very important vehicles of finance, very influential here in our continent. The role of SOEs, the state-owned enterprises and their direct finance role. There is the role of asset management companies, not to be confused, as it happens in some countries, with sovereign wealth funds. There are temporary vehicles for some temporary arrangements with special purpose attached to them. Of course, I appreciate that the focus is MDBs and NDBs, but again, when I see issues related to country priorities, country ownership, where that is going to be coming from? It's an assumption that you can really see it. Typically, even in the days of the Washington Consensus, there was an assumption about country ownership, how that ownership happened, were they forced to own it, incentivized to own it, nudged to own it. But, well, there was an assumption that successful programs of structural reforms assumed a country ownership. But anyways, the best way to assess a country ownership is through one thing supported by another thing. That one thing is the most important document that comes from any state, which is the budget of the state. This is the central budget or the national budget. If you are in a federalized system, that could really be more decentralized. But here there is some rare reference to how can I understand, especially from the recommendations about enhancing country ownership and the beneficiaries' ownership, how can I know that if this is owned or not? It's basically about the discipline of budget, that the finance is going on system and on budget all the time, that the budget with its design has been sending the signals that, yes, we're doing what we can to fund education, health, but we are realizing some gaps. So can we get more funds either from local or national NDBs and from multilateral development banks? This is the way that you can really see if there is some sort of ownership translated by the budget through the size of the budget, prioritization of the budget, and signaling of the budget. The other thing, which is, haven't heard the acronyms, but I was reminded that some of us were at an important discussion in Barcelona in preparation of the FFD, and it's very much visible in the piece on the Integrated National Financial Framework, because here it's assumed that the Integrated National Financial Framework is going to be the kind of ultimate connector between the costing of the SDGs and assessing what could be mobilized through domestic resource mobilization, assessing what could be done through signaling to the private sector domestically and externally. And then comes ODA through the multilateral development banks or the NDBs that, and the bilateral channels of the NDB that could really complement. So here I think that could really, especially that there are 80 plus countries are using integrated national financial framework, that could really be useful to have. Then that gets me into, and very quickly, and please remind me if I'm going beyond my time, but these are very much important paper. I'm not using them with my academic hat as assessing the paper and its coverage and all of that. It's beyond that. It's basically I take these papers seriously. Great contribution to our knowledge, have been really great to read all of them. So I'm taking them from that perspective, especially for the applied work that they got themselves into. So on the maximization of collaboration between the MDBs, and I read in that first the paper about realizing the potential that some, if not all, MDBs feel that they are not treated equal by the MDBs. I think in today's world, everybody will be feeling equal, and some NDBs would be even feeling some sort of freedom and advantage of being calling shots on, or with more flexibility. So perhaps that perception or that feeling may not last. But again, what's in it for the client, again, or the beneficiary to have this kind of equal treatment? What will happen? Well, it really what I call the best rule of engagement with external finance. It's the Deng Xiaoping rule. In that famous discussion, and apologies for those who heard me saying that before, when he met Mr. McNamara, the president of the World Bank, he told him, "Thank you so much for coming to Beijing. I am very happy to partner with you. We can do it without you. Doing it meaning development. But with you, we can do it faster and better." So everything here needs really to go through that filter. If that kind of collaboration between the MDBs and the NDBs, and then being equal for the Egypt or the South Africa of the world, will I be getting better treatment or not? Or is it just different bureaucracies of NDBs and MDBs fighting who is calling the shot, who is leading the mission, who is putting the document that should be followed by the country? If it is a kind of a game of that nature, I would say, despite the fact that I lived in these organizations for 15 years and I worked with them for another 15 years, the World Bank, the IMF, and now with the UN, this kind of turf fighting and who's boss and who's equal and not, this is not really of the interest. And here that comes the issue of ownership. The countries that, and we see that in the continent, there are some countries, and here the South collaboration, I would say Egyptians, I can talk freely about my country, at least relatively, that we can learn a great deal from better experience of collaboration coming from countries like Jordan or Morocco when it comes to maximization of the benefits of external finance. Whenever there is a new vehicle in town, you'll find a Moroccan representative or a Jordanian representative realizing what's new and knocking on the door. And then coordinating the whole system from the ministries of finance to the line ministries to the Department of International Cooperation. So that kind of coordination between MDBs and NDBs will not really necessarily leave it to the generosity of coordination and working happily together from the outside, but that kind of coordination should come from the country itself. So it has its budget, it has its integrated national financial framework, and then gets all of these people together realizing the comparative advantage. There are some things that bilateral channels could be better at. There are some channels of cooperation obviously could be left for the MDBs. Then the other recommendations, yes, please do more on scaling concessional finance, expand that. Can we really get it? Can we really get it? More ODA? Well, if you're not happy with that piece that I did with HOMI for Brookings, there is another piece that HOMI participated in with the Center of Global Development. That's basically telling you, they put it in the most polite language, on the three alternatives of the fast ways to development. That ODA, either by the OECD kind of suggestions, or by the Gates Foundation innovation model, or by the pooling and collaborative model, by revising slightly with dynamism the common but differentiated responsibility, of all of these pathways is telling us again that ODA is as we know it, has ended, but then we need to think of something else. So what exactly are we expanding? Concessional finance for climate? Yes, I hope. Good luck with that. For development, unless we are getting more on the mobilization within regions, and here there are missing factors here. It's very much global, these papers, focusing on national coordination and ownership, but there is a regional part that could really be providing solutions. It's not really very much obvious in the papers, and there is a local impact that needs really to be enhanced. Then, very quickly on the double standards, I'm happy to see double standards being used in an attractive way in a title. Normally it comes with negative connotations, but here the double standards are fine. But basically, when I take it from the receiving end, it's very, very hard to draw a very thin line between what's climate finance and what's development finance. While I appreciate very much the magicians who wrote this paper, it's easier from those who are allocating funding. But when you come to my village, Kafr Shokr of Egypt, I have fellow villagers wouldn't really mind getting the money from a development agency or climate agency as far as it is going to be fixing the problem of adaptation in agriculture or water management system. Will it come from the World Bank or a vertical fund? Will it come because of solidarity approach or coming from long-term development partnership? Pragmatism will dominate the scene, and practical consideration will dominate the scene. I have a couple of things to say about JETP, but the good moderator here gave me a warning signal that I need to wrap up. Paper 3, I will not be equal in the assessments, but or trying to assess the findings or their recommendations. But the paper here on the scaling up of finance, about all of these MDBs must establish clear policies for partnering with NDBs. I would say, well, what if they don't do it? What if they don't have a World Bank strategy? The World Bank has a strategy for everything, including a strategy for welcoming you at the doors of the bank. But anyway, what if you don't have that strategy? That kind of thing, again, leave it to the countries and get the countries to share knowledge when it comes to that, because I'm not quite sure what this kind of strategy. It will be a strategy built on experience of transactions, but may not really get us a kind of a policy or a strategy. And if I didn't really get it right, please correct me. And then the rest of the story is on the risk-sharing mechanisms and how can we enhance the work. Here, I cannot really comment, but please do more on that. Develop innovative guarantee products. I would say, well, great, always fine to have innovation, but we have a great deal of classic plain vanilla kind of guarantees that we didn't exhaust finally. Finally, on that piece, on vulnerability, yes, your finding is to the point, based on the facts. That kind of discrepancy between the bilaterals and the MDBs and the NDBs is very much realized. But can we see, given that the FFD is going to be discussing the beyond GDP as well, will we, if we have a new approach of beyond GDP that really can have emphasis on areas of vulnerability, and in this case the issues about classification of countries based on low income or middle income and with different segments, will change down the road? Will that make any kind of a change in your assessment? And then what is exactly the recommendation here? Is to do more work with vulnerable countries. The classification, they are low-income countries, some of them, of these low-income countries, and fragile and post-conflict countries until very recently, when we found that even middle-income countries can be vulnerable. So in this case, they will be beneficiaries of low-income countries' arrangements, including giving them exceptions of being treated like IDA countries in the case of the World Bank, or some concessional consideration by others. So I would say it's good that we have the multilateral development banks are focusing in the vulnerable cases, because pooling of risks and the variety of expertise and the presence in the ground can make these MDBs more qualified to do more with vulnerable countries and get the NDBs enhancing the work. But I would put it again in a systems approach. It's much more complex than the M and the N of the DBs. The world is full of other players that we should really bring them into the system for better maximization of whatever left of what we have of development finance. Good luck. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, and for covering a lot of issues, and certainly thinking about some of the platforms having all of these, bringing all these platform partners together, and also for a lot of thinking on what country ownership could really mean and how do we actually get there, I think is really helpful. But maybe turning to one of those other actors, our next, the next person to comment would be Antti Kurhunen, who's the Director for Sustainable Finance, Investment and Jobs, Economy that works, the Director General for International Partnerships of the European Commission. So is that your whole title, Sustainable Investment, Finance and Jobs, Economy that works for the people?
Thanks a lot, Shari. No, it's horrible. I didn't choose my title. And we are known to be a bit complex institution, so there we are. But thanks a lot, Shari, for the intro, and good evening to all. And thanks a lot for sticking around and at this hour still. We have heard, I think, 4 really excellent and very important academic presentations today, and I've listened with careful interest what Mahmoud Moeldin had to say about that, and I agree with much of what he said. I agree also, by the way, what you said about the integrated national financial frameworks and their potential as country-owned platforms. So very much the same opinion. So maybe let me add, therefore, a viewpoint which comes from an EU policymaker that represents a union that is actually a political construct which has its own policy objectives and which also has its own relationships with our partner countries. Indeed, our policy is based on partnerships that are mutually beneficial, and they build on the Global Gateway strategy that is our 300 billion investment offer to our partners, with focus on green and digital transition and infrastructure investment. So it's also our key delivery mechanism for the SDGs. And with the current Commission that started just the beginning of this year, our objective is to scale up the Global Gateway as we move forward. So indeed, Shari, going back to your intro, we are, yes, living uncertain times, but I guess I could say that the EU message is that we will stay engaged and on sustainable investments. And indeed, you also talked about impact. So our objective is to achieve impact with our Global Gateway strategy. And that means that, as we know, the scarcity of ODA is a reality. It's unlikely to get much better. So it means for us that we must use every euro of the European taxpayers very efficiently. And we need to see the results of our actions. So it's actually an offensive agenda, not a defensive agenda, to try to achieve with our partner countries those and realize those investments that really can make a difference in moving and narrowing the SDG investment gap. So let me then go back to this the role of the PDBs, which are very close partners to us, and I want to put this into this fixed context also. So we very strongly support the fixed effort of making the PDBs work as one system. It's really crucial to understand that the versatility of the PDBs from multinational to regional to national and local requires obviously a lot of effort, but we think that it's crucial and it holds a lot of opportunities. And I think that all of the 4 presentations also brought that aspect very, very, very well up front. So therefore, also as we are now negotiating the outcome of the Financing for Development, the Sevilla document for June, it's really timely to see that the fix is a milestone for that. It's important that we here will have an ambitious contribution to boost the FFD outcome document, and I think that this collaboration, stronger collaboration, is really a good message to take forward there. So therefore the EU really commends, and we strongly support the significant work that has been done already to prepare the fixed contribution, and just reading the different documents quite carefully, we would really welcome those ideas that are being developed on areas like first making the PDBs the enablers of the SDGs, which with sustainability at the core of the PDB mandates. And secondly, designing one coherent PDB system and moving away from the current fragmented architecture, improving efficiency, complementarities and synergies, and also building trust among the PDBs. And thirdly, empowering PDBs by mobilizing the resources through optimizing balance sheets, removing risk management related barriers for scaling up, and enhancing pipeline development, and in particular catalyzing private investment. So we also see FIX as a forum to take forward the ideas in the which were already mentioned in the MDB head's viewpoint note from April last year on MDBs working as a system for impact and scale. We have, as EU, we have welcomed these ideas in the G20 context, and moreover, we've followed very closely the MDB reform agendas. And one of the ideas that came through the papers was that, mirroring that in the PDP context as a sort of a whole of the PDP system could be actually a quite interesting idea. We have, as EU, very actively engaged in the broader discussion on the international financial architecture in most fora, G20, G7, Paris Summit, UN, the World Bank's and IMF's annual and spring meetings, and we are very keen to continue now in the FIX context and also together with all of our bilateral PDP partners, one by one or all together, we are very keen to engage in this discussion. So one thing that we just would like to highlight is that we do need coherence, as we have so many fora where we are discussing, so that we don't lose track. In the wider international financial architecture discussion, the EU is engaging in favor of innovative solutions to scale up availability of financing through private sector mobilization. We put domestic resource mobilization very high on our agenda, and also we'd like to combine that with sound public finance management. And so lastly, we see these efforts of the PDPs to collaborate better to be really well aligned with our EU policy objectives, and notably the Global Gateway. So our focus is to maximize the impact. We do so by supporting investments in digital and green transition, in mobility, in health, education and research. And we support these investments through risk-sharing mechanisms like the EFSD plus guarantees and blended finance. And what we try to do is to provide sort of integrated packages to our partners with technical assistance, with budget support, so that we can improve the enabling environment and investment climate, including the skills agenda and the capacity development, whether institutions or otherwise. And let me finalize just by saying that our Global Gateway objectives really greatly benefit actually from the stronger partnership and cooperation among the whole spectrum of PDPs. Because we can be more powerful together. We can address transformative investment needs and opportunities if we share data, if we harmonize procedures, if we have mutual reliance arrangements, if we cooperate at country level, and if we strengthen the co-financing activities. So therefore, we really strongly support this agenda.
Thank you so much, and great to hear the EU's continued commitment despite a very challenging environment. I'm going to go quickly to our last speaker. So to Lavinia Boris de Castro, who is actually in a PDB, who is the advisor to the presidency in Benedessa. And I'd be really interested to hear about your thoughts on PDBs working together, but really you can also respond to the papers, obviously.
Sure. So thank you so much for this invitation. I will also like to compliment Reggie, Samantha, Jean-Baptiste, Vincent, Marie-Lou, because they did a great job. I mean, this conference is amazing, so just for you. It's like, so I will concentrate my comments on Thomas Marois, and Richard Kazuo enjoyed the other papers, but I don't have anything to add, I think. So I think they are both very complementary, as Richard mentioned, and they start with some assumptions that I think most of us will agree. Billions to trillions did not happen. De-risking means much more public banks taking all the risk, which is kind of difficult, and dealing with fiscal constraints at the same time. And MDB's alliance with NDBs is an alternative that has already happened but needs to be improved. And PDBs are super climate finance but are too slow, too complex, and needs to escalate and to be faster. So they both bring evidence and examples where it's not working. And Richard papers discuss some evidence of success of some very good, interesting cases. And both bring to light how can we improve collaborations. And the first comment I have, it was very interesting because reading Marois' paper, it was exactly matching the experience I had. I spent like 2 years on working on a fund for guarantees for small and medium enterprise, and I was dealing with KfW, with the World Bank, and also with the IDB and the Green Climate Fund. So I found it like exactly. So it's interesting because in his paper sometimes he says, oh, you know something, we stopped making interviews because people were repeating themselves. I say, yeah, if they interview me, I will say the same. So great job. I think it really matches. And now I have a point to agree to disagree, not with what just said. He makes this point about inconsistencies among MDBs, and I think consistency of criteria is very important. Otherwise, we lost a lot of time. We have to have clearly what we accept, what we don't accept, the rules before starting negotiations, because the negotiations take too long. So I think so having specific benchmarks or reporting standards, I agree. I disagree because they just said, well, maybe we shouldn't be so coherent. Well, okay, I think there is place for everybody, but like standards, reporting, taxonomies, and so on are very important to make things more fast. So, and I do agree that working sometimes with other national development banks for getting funds can be more easy than with multilateral, which is more easy than the GCF and the global funds, if I have to put it on a scale on my own experience. But now let's move to Kazuo and then bring some things that I think could complement. Well, Kazuo brings evidence that PPPs are simply not working. They are smaller than we thought, less effective than we wanted, and they claim it, and leverage less in capital markets than it was supposed to, which is very interesting and very sharp, as he always are. And he talks about local money and problems of donation, and it's true. I mean, when several times these banks were dealing with us, they are offering in dollar terms, but many of them accept to take the exchange rate risk. IDB, for example, accepted. So there is some flexibility. We have to work at that with them, especially when we're dealing with small and medium enterprise, because they won't accept the risk. So we have to work on that. Well, I would also say that there is one point that I am not sure what I think about it. But Marois make this point in talking about, I think it was the Islamic Bank. he talks about competition. He said that the resources were too expensive. They were complaining that it was too expensive to compete with the others. And then this is a big question that sometimes I ask myself, should we compete? It's not clear for me, because in some sense the private sector will not do what we do. They will not put conditions, conditionalities. You say so that in your paper. But and once I heard someone from KfW saying, well, you know, a little bit of competition is quite important because to shake things up and so on. But sometimes what I see is national development banks competing with multilateral development banks and with subnational development banks for the same project. So that's not right. I mean, so we should improve and think how can we deal with that to be more complementary, because there is much to be done. A second point I would like to talk is about capital. I think Richard mentioned very interesting positions in terms of the many development banks really have a scarcity of capital. And Ricardo Gottschalk, he co-authored with me. He's the first author of the paper, and he was trying to talk with EADB, BOLD, BDAC, and TDB to understand. And the main complaint is capital, is the lack of capital. But the paper shows something interesting, which it's not on the paper, and I think it could be complementary, is that the equity ratios is very low. And this first thing we thought, is that a problem of low risk appetite? Because it could be. But it seems that it's like all those banks, they have very low leverage. For example, EADB is 0.4 in equity ratio, equity against assets. So it's very low. They're almost like, because they have very small capital. And one of the things that people have to understand about development banks at the projects, many times when they deal with infrastructure, the projects are so big that one project can kill yourself. So you have to be cautious. On the other hand, we don't want the banks to sit on the money. So, and they are having those low equity ratios because they want to receive good rates in Moody's and other credit agencies. But then I have to comment that many times for multilateral development banks, they don't fulfill Basel, but they have this rule that they can leverage maximum 4 to have the AAA. Who established this 4? Based in what? I would like to understand, because it seems to me very low. Or maybe we could talk that for climate risk, we need to leverage more. Maybe we can have a proposition to make to this rating agency. So that's a point that I would like to. So leverage is not only capital, lack of capital, but the leverage is very low because of this problem that they don't have rating otherwise, and then that becomes a problem. Okay. So in terms of, I wouldn't say this is not on the paper, but I would like to talk a little bit about some recommendations. I think we should work to improve national regulations to climate green finance. We must have special regulatory regimes. Climate change is not costly, it's also risky. So we have to have some flexibilization on that. The second point is I think we should create special taxation regimes. You mentioned that in some sense in your paper, but I should stress that. In my experience, I was discussing each project we have to discuss how much is going to have, how much the Brazilian Central Bank will allow us, and with the Ministry of so it takes a long time. Okay. So the third thing is we should simplify process. They both say so, but sometimes I feel the demands, especially the multilateral demands they are like too strong and do not match the reality we have in our countries. Okay, so demands should exist, but maybe they are not ex ante for taking the credit, but it can be like later, a construction. Okay, so increasing requirements over time instead of asking them before the loan is done. And NDB also have to improve their process and create simplified practical manuals for climate finance, promote training. It's not only the problem of MDB, it's also a problem of national development banks in my view. So MDB and PDBs could work together to harmonize requirements among climate finance mechanisms and increase this systemic coherence that I mentioned. In terms of guarantees, in my experience and what I see in BNES, that guarantees is very important in two cases, small and medium enterprise, and also for the first phase of huge infrastructure projects, the pre-operational phase. So I think we should think about that. And another thing in terms of like improving monitoring and evaluation, we need, but also maybe I have to call attention that we also have to have auditing, because we don't have auditors in the countries, and the poor countries prepare it. So we always have to take them from the MDB or from the multilateral development banks. I think we should create some projects are so important that you should have like a fast track. Why don't we have like some strategic committees and then, well, this project is really important, so let's downsize the demands and make it faster. So I think we could be like a little bit more flexible. And one thing that I would complain is why not pension funds, why not sovereign funds, but you just mentioned in your presentation, so I think it's another paper and I'm waiting for reading. Okay? Okay, so it's this is, and the last one is just to talk about the necessity to not forget about macroeconomics and the importance of dealing with the debt ratio, especially for African countries, because without that, we won't go anywhere. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and a lot of really great ideas. And thank you all for staying late, because I know we're keeping you from drinks, so apologies for that. But thank you, Lavinia, for all of those really good ideas, and even this thought about the projects being under-levered, and because the projects may be too big, and it really calls for working together. So in ways that can then take advantage of this. So I think there's lots to take from these discussions, lots I'm taking back to the negotiations to think about, and I hope lots to follow up on and to continue to think of this as one big process. So FIX goes to FFD4. FFD4 will be a launching pad for more additional work going forward. And so these are all steps in the process. And thanks so much to the panelists and to the commenters for all of your papers and the work that's really helping, I think, move the political process forward. So I can really see the link between the research, the discussions, the MDB work, and then the PDB work, and then the political process as well. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.